They whispered later that Charleston had always held its ghosts close, but none so stubborn as the one that wore the name Lot 47. Long before the records were burned and the men involved met their quiet ruin, the city already trembled around the edges of her shadow. It began in the late 1840s, when an anomaly crept into the ledgers of Ryan Smartso's slate in ink, yet so enormous in consequence that even hardened traders refused to speak of it aloud. She appeared simply as a notation beside a number, Lot 47, female, approximately 19, mute, a detail so plain it should have dissolved into the sea of other names, other bodies, other lives, bought and sold in Charleston's daily ritual of cruelty. But she did not dissolve. She persisted, passing through 17 owners in 4 years, each man returning her within days, though she cost them dearly. That alone was enough to stir whispers. But the men themselves added fuel. Some merely fled from her. Others broke. 3 abandoned the plantations that had carried their family's wealth for generations. 2 died with faces so stricken their kin hid the circumstances from public record. The auction house finally burned her papers in 1851 and claimed water damage, though no storm had touched Charleston that year. They thought that would erase her, but a woman like Lot 47 could not be erased. She was not a presence one forgot. She was a presence one survived. Charleston in 1847 was a city clothed in elegance but built upon terror. Its rice and cotton fortunes shimmered on the surface like moonlight on marsh water, concealing the rot beneath. Enslaved people outnumbered the free whites 2 to 1, and the city's elite lived in constant, silent dread of the many hands they commanded. Refinement became a shield. House servants trained to glide quietly through polished rooms, to read a master's needs before they formed into words. A mute woman, trained and beautiful, was a luxury beyond price. She entered this world without history, a ghost in human form. Her origin was recorded as a vague reference to a deceased estate in Beaufort County, a place, a death, a transaction scrubbed clean before anyone could ask questions. Her bill of sale was so strangely assembled that even the auctioneer, Virgil Hask, a man who had spent decades passing lies from truth, felt uneasy when he touched it. The handwriting shifted midway as though 2 different men had written the document. Dates blurred as if smeared by an invisible hand. The executor's signature looked as though someone had tried to imitate another's flourish and failed. Yet the woman herself stood exactly as described, young, straight-backed, composed. Her silence did not seem like a lack, but a choice. When Hask positioned her on the block, she did not tremble or drop her gaze. She stared past the bidders toward something none of them could see, as though she recognized a future they could not avoid. The winning bidder was Richard Galliard of Fairweather Plantation, a widower, exhausted from grief and solitude. He had lost his wife to childbirth and was left with 2 anxious daughters who needed tending. A mute servant seemed perfect. No gossiped secrets, no whispered stories carried through the quarters like drifting sparks. He paid an astonishing sum, $1,240 more than most men would dare spend for someone whose past was a sealed door. Galliard brought her home in the quiet way one transports fragile things. He placed her in a small room off the kitchen, gave her blankets and tasks, mending, light, cleaning, tending to the motherless girls. The other enslaved people were instructed to help her settle. They tried, but even on the first night, something was wrong. She did not sleep, or if she did, her body never surrendered to it. She lay still with her eyes closed, but her breaths came evenly, too evenly, like someone pretending to mimic the rhythm of sleep without ever entering it. And sometimes, after midnight, a sound drifted from her small room, low, steady, humming, not song, not speech, something that vibrated bone before it touched the ear. On the 3rd night, Gallard's eldest child woke screaming. She said the mute woman had been standing beside her bed in the dark, so close the girl could feel the warmth of her breath. Galliard dismissed it as a child's nightmare until the next night, when he himself jolted awake to see the woman standing at the foot of his bed, silent, motionless, her eyes catching the candlelight. Like polished obsidian, he demanded to know why she was there. She offered no gesture, no sign of apology or confusion. She simply existed in the space where she should not have been. Watching him with a calmness that felt like accusation, Galliard returned her the next morning, pale and shaken, taking a $300 loss gladly. Whatever she was, he would not keep her another night. Her second buyer, Thomas Porcher, prided himself on being harder than Galliard. He kept her in the quarters, forbade her from entering his house, and assured his overseer that firmness would cure whatever strangeness haunted her. On the 5th morning they found Porcher in his study, awake but frozen, his eyes fixed not on the window but through it, as though seeing some bleak landscape beyond this world. When he finally stirred, the first words he choked out were, "Get her off my land." She had never stepped inside his house. Back to Charleston she went, sold again, and again, and again. A pattern was forming, written not in ink but in fear. Rumors crept through the taverns and down the alleys of East Bay Street. The mute woman who ruined households, the one who drove men from their beds, from their lands, from their sanity. Some called her cursed. Others said she carried the memory of atrocities too terrible to speak, and her silence was the only thing holding those secrets at bay. A few whispered she wasn't a woman at all. but something that wore the shape of one. Virgil Hask, the auctioneer who had first sold her, began to feel the wrongness pressing into his thoughts like a fog. He recorded a note in his ledger, one that survived fire and time. Rumors circulate regarding Lot 47, but rumors were only the beginning. The next man to claim her was Marcus Brevard of Edisto Island, a rational planter, a collector of data and tallies, a man who believed the world could be measured and therefore controlled. If any man was immune to superstition, it was Brevard. His journals held years of entries, weather charts, crop ratios, behavioral notes on every enslaved person in his possession. He believed order was armored. He kept Lot 47 for 9 days. Just 9. His early entries about her read with a clinical detachment of a man taking the measure of livestock, competent, obedient, skilled, the woman who worked with the eerie precision of someone whose thoughts lay elsewhere. But on the 3rd day he noticed her lips moving when she stood alone, forming words without breath or sound. He watched from a doorway, unseen. She was not praying. She was not mouthing instructions. Her lips shaped syllables that did not belong to any language Brevard recognized. On the 5th night, he woke to find his bedroom door open, though he distinctly remembered locking it. He found her in the hallway, a shadow sculpted into the form of a woman, her face calm, eyes fixed on him, offering neither explanation nor retreat. He confined her to the quarters thereafter. It made no difference. Locks did not restrain her. Boundaries did not deter her. The morning of the 7th day, she stood outside his 2nd-story bedroom window. Brevard's plantation house was built high on brick to escape the rot of the swamp. There was no ladder. The drain spout was too frail to support a child, let alone a grown woman. She simply stood there, staring inward through the glass. By the 9th day, Brevard's handwriting had degenerated into trembling lines. He confessed in his journal that he no longer slept, that he could no longer think without feeling her gaze on him, even when she was nowhere near. He wrote that when he closed his eyes, he saw her face in perfect stillness, waiting for him to admit something he did not yet understand. And then, with the clarity of a man approaching madness, he wrote, "Something is deeply wrong." He returned her to Charleston. The next morning, from there, her price fell as steadily as her legend grew. Wealthy planters no longer wanted her, and those who still dared place bids were the desperate, the cruel, or the arrogant men who believed they could break whatever haunted her. A lumber mill operator saw an opportunity. He put her to work feeding logs, her hands moving with mechanical precision. By daylight she was ordinary, but on the 3rd night the mill caught fire. The flames consumed everything. Though witnesses swore she had been locked in the workers' quarters, the operator did not care. He insisted she was responsible anyway. He sold her in haste. Another man, a rice planter, tried field work. She performed well. She worked quietly. Yet the workers refused to sleep near her. They said the air thickened when she stood nearby, as though she pulled something unseen into the rooms around her. On the 13th day, the planter's son disappeared into the swamp. The search lasted 3 days, before they found the boy half conscious in the reeds, lips cracked from thirst, babbling that he had followed the woman who could not speak. He insisted she had called him, not with sound, but something deeper, a pull, a direction the boy could not explain. None of them could. After that, no price was too low for her to be rid of. 17 sales, 17 failures, a trail of collapsing households, ruined men, and unrecorded horrors stretching across the low country like a fever dream. In Charleston's bars, men who prided themselves on cruelty whispered about her with a nervous reverence normally reserved for Romans. They called her a curse, a blight, a plague wrapped in human flesh. But when whiskey loosened tongues, some said the truth was simpler and far more terrifying. She made men remember, not the surface sins, the drunken nights or petty cruelties, but the buried ones, the ones they had locked in their bones, the ones they had built entire lives upon forgetting. Virgil Hask, who had once sneered at superstition, began to feel a weight on his conscience whenever her name appeared in his ledger. He sought out the men who had owned her. He listened to their halting, shame-soaked stories. He assembled their confessions into a chronology he never intended another living soul to read. And the deeper he dug, the more he felt the same cold truth creeping toward him. What haunted Lot 47 was not darkness. It was clarity. A clarity so severe that it stripped men of the lies they told themselves about what they had done in this world. A mirror polished with suffering, but even mirrors have origins. And the origins of Lot 47 were darker than anything the Low Country had yet imagined. The 15th buyer was the first to approach her, not with arrogance or fear, but with calculation. Nathaniel Harrington of Jacksonboro, planter, naturalist, methodical man of science, believed he could solve her the way one might solve a strange phenomenon of weather or soil. He'd heard the rumors, of course. Everyone had, but he dismissed them as the nervous inventions of weak men. Harrington kept meticulous journals in a tight, almost claustrophobic hand. He trusted ink more than instinct, and in those ink-clotted pages, the truth of his unraveling would one day sit waiting for a graduate student to stumble upon more than a century later. He bought her for $180 in November of 1850, so little that he privately felt embarrassed for her. Like securing a fine instrument at the price of scrap, he brought her home to his plantation. where the marshland stretched out pale and cold beneath winter skies and the wind. Teeth chattered through the reeds. He gave her a room of her own, not out of kindness but for controlled observation. He instructed his wife Margaret to note every detail. Margaret complied with the resigned obedience of a woman long accustomed to her husband's experiments: birds in cages, strange soil samples pressed under glass, children in the quarters measured like livestock. The first days were uneventful, even dull. Harrington wrote that she performed tasks with brisk competence. She interpreted gestures with uncanny accuracy. She worked silently, but with a serenity that made Margaret say the woman's presence felt like sitting near a still pond on a windless day and settling in its perfect calm. It was only at night that the air in the house began to change. The first night, Harrington was wrenched awake by a sound he later compared to a vibration beneath the world. It was humming so low, it seemed to begin in the floorboards, coil up through the mattress and finally settle into his ribs. He rose, lantern in hand, and traced it to the woman's door. She lay still on her pallet, eyes closed, but the sound emanated from somewhere deeper than her throat, as if her very bones were resonating with grief. When he touched her shoulder, the sound died instantly. Her eyes opened without surprise, without sleepiness, without guilt. She simply looked at him. He retreated. On the third night, Margaret shook him awake, trembling violently. "Someone is in the room," she whispered. Her voice was thin with dread. Harrington lit the candle. The woman stood near the wardrobe, a silhouette cut from darkness itself. She did not move. She did not blink. She did not flinch at the light. He returned her to her room and locked the door from the outside. He tested the lock 3 times before going back to bed. At dawn, she stood in the kitchen preparing breakfast. The lock was still sealed. On the 5th night she appeared in his study, her hand resting lightly on a journal he had hidden behind other books, a journal from 1843, the year he had separated a family for profit, a mother begging for her children, her pleas drowned by the clatter of coins, the year he had buried that memory in ink and denial. How had she known? Why that journal? Why that page? The questions rattled him. He began sleeping less, pacing more. The floors grew familiar with the weight of his fear. He wrote that his dreams filled with the faces of the people he'd sold, faces he had not thought of. In 7 years, faces given shape again by the simple presence of a woman who never spoke. Night after night, she came to him, sometimes standing in the hallway, sometimes in the corner of his bedroom, sometimes in places she could not physically reach, unless the house itself bent to her will. He tried to deny it. He tried to rationalize it, but her presence felt like the heavy stare of a truth too long avoided. One night, he dreamed of the mother he had separated in 1843. He saw the raw grief on her face as if she stood in his room. When he woke, the woman stood at the foot of his bed, watching him, calm as ever. For the first time since boyhood, he wept. Her silence did not soothe him. It exposed him. By the 15th night, Harrington had reached his limit. He took her back to Charleston, not to sell her, but to confess. He went to the church. He told Father O'Malley everything. Every sale, every cry, every cruelty, every lie, every secret. The priest listened, grave and unmoving. When Harrington finished, Father O'Malley said quietly, "Perhaps God has sent you a mirror." Harrington was not a man given to religious metaphor, but the word struck him like a lantern falling against an oil-soaked floor. When he returned home, he drafted manumission papers for 3 families he had enslaved. He freed them. He put money aside for their futures. He made provisions in his will to free the rest upon his death. He had spent a lifetime believing cruelty was a system, not a choice. Now he saw it for what it was, something he had done with full consciousness, full agency, and full responsibility. He never saw her again, but the mirror she held had already shown him everything. Asterisk. The 16th buyer, Cornelius Gage, was not a man easily shaken. He owned a rice plantation near the Combahee River, isolated from neighbors by miles of swamp and the thick, humming silence of the low country. Gage believed in 2 things: the lash and his own authority. He mocked the whispered stories about the mute woman. To him, fear was a weakness. Men indulged when discipline failed. He bought her for $125, less than the price of a mule, less than the cost of a single iron plow. To Gage, she was a bargain, a wounded thing he could break into usefulness. He put her to work in the rice fields by day, where the mud sucked at ankles and mosquitoes clung to skin like burning needles. By night, she was locked alone in a rice barn separate from every other structure on the property. Gage told his overseer, Thaddeus Cooper, that if she escaped or wandered again, she would be whipped until she learned her place. She did not try to escape. She did not speak. She did not resist. And yet the plantation began to rot around her. Within 3 days, the rice seedlings withered in the paddies as if scalded by invisible heat. Dikes that had stood firm for years began to leak. Equipment splintered. Men injured themselves in strange, avoidable accidents. Burned hands, twisted ankles, a cracked rib from a falling beam no one could explain. Cooper, a man who'd worked rice for 15 years and believed the land itself spoke when something was wrong, told Gage the truth plainly. "She carries a curse with her. We must send her away." Gage laughed in his face. But the land did not laugh. and neither did the nights. On 3 weeks' time, Gage began to unravel. His sleeplessness came first, dragging him from bed to wander the fields at 2, 3, 4 in the morning. Cooper watched from shadows as the master stood outside the barn where the woman was confined, his posture stiff with dread, as though waiting for something to emerge from within. One night in the 21st, Gage unlocked the barn and stepped inside. He remained there for almost 2 hours. No one knows exactly what passed between them, but Cooper said that when Gage emerged, he looked like a man who had buried himself alive and was just now discovering the weight of the soil above him. His face was gray, his movements slow, his eyes hollow, as if stripped of all illusions. The next morning, he freed every enslaved person he owned, all 47 of them. He drafted papers, gave them supplies, pressed money into their hands with a desperation that stunned Cooper. He told the overseer the plantation was finished and released him from employment. Then Gage took the woman's son and changed to Charleston, but he did not return her to the traders. Something in him had cracked beyond the point of cruelty. Instead, he sought out a ship captain named William Drexel, a man who sailed regularly to Nassau. What Gage said or paid to secure passage was never written down, only that Drexel accepted the woman as cargo bound for the Caribbean. Gage returned to his empty plantation alone, and the Low Country whispered his name for years afterward. Drexel should have ended the story, but the sea, it seems, has ways of unraveling men just as the marshes do. 6 weeks later, the captain returned to Charleston with eyes hollowed by something no storm had carved. He arrived at night something. He never did, abandoning protocol and cargo, so he could go directly to the house of Virgil Hask. Hask's wife later wrote to her sister that Drexel looked like a man hunted by his own shadow. He demanded to speak with Hask immediately, and once inside, he began to tell a story that passed through Charleston's trading circles like a sickness. The woman had been quiet in the hold. She ate, she drank, she caused no trouble. But at night the crew began screaming themselves awake. One sailor dreamt of the child he had abandoned in Liverpool 20 years earlier and woke sobbing. Another confessed to murder in a fevered panic. A third admitted desertion. None had spoken these scenes aloud before. And Drexel, he saw a fire. Not any fire, but the warehouse blaze in Philadelphia, the one that had killed 3 night watchmen. Drexel had profited from the insurance payout. He had known the fire was set deliberately by his partner, and he had looked the other way. Every night at sea, those dead men burned again behind his eyelids, and every night, when he woke gasping, she stood at the entrance to the hold, watching, silent, unbroken. When they reached Nassau, Drexel paid a local planter to take her. He didn't wait for cargo. He didn't even take on fresh water. He turned his ship around and fled the island like a man outrunning his own heartbeat. On the voyage back, the nightmares ended, but something inside Drexel remained altered. He could no longer pretend ignorance, no longer wear indifference like a captain's coat. He made one more voyage. Then he sold his ship. He spent the rest of his life aiding freed people and speaking against the trade that had enriched him. But the woman was not done. Weeks after Drexel's confession, a letter arrived from Nassau addressed to Hask. The planter who had taken her wrote only, "Returning your property on next ship. Cannot keep her. Will accept no payment. Destroy all records of this transaction." And so, after crossing the ocean, she returned to Charleston. Unchanged, unbroken, silent. She had been gone nearly 4 years, and yet she looked as though no time had passed for her at all. Something in Hask snapped then, not from fear, but from realization. This woman would not stop until someone understood her, and someone had to try. Asterisk. When she returned to Charleston in March of 1851, 4 years after her first sail, Hask felt something in the air around her, something like stillness after a storm, the kind of quiet that makes a man's hands tremble because he knows the worst is not behind him, but ahead. He could not sell her again. He would not because the law forbade it, or because her trail of ruin frightened him, but because the truth had finally settled its claws into him. Every time he handed her to another man, he was sentencing that man to the same unraveling. He, Virgil Hask, auctioneer, trader, dealer in flesh, was the mechanism of her torment and theirs. He brought her to the small room behind his office, a storage space that smelled faintly of tallow, dust, and old rope. It was not a home, but it was safe. He gave her a bed, a blanket, a lantern, meals twice a day. He forbade his clerks from entering the room without him present. He hired her quietly for small tasks, paying her from his own pocket. Not charity, not pity. Fear, perhaps, but also something like guilt finally awakening. And then he began the grim work of searching for her origins. The bill of sale said Beaufort County, so that was where he went. The courthouse reeked of mildew, old paper, and resignation. Clerks shuffled through damaged ledgers like men digging graves, and among the ashes of fire-scorched records, Hask found what felt like the first pulse of truth. There had been a fire in early 1847, the clerk said, half the records lost. But the clerk, an old man named Bentley, remembered something more. A planter, Edmund Lell, had hurried through town that February, filing paperwork with the panic of a man racing death itself, selling everything, settling his affairs without being sick. He looked hunted, Bentley whispered, like he heard footsteps behind him. Hask followed the trail to Lel's remaining estate files. Among them lay a single chilling entry. Female, approximately 27, mute, household trained. Sold to J. Merchant, Charleston trader. The name hit Hask like a blow. Merchant had been his competitor, dead now. 2 years his records scattered across the city like fallen leaves. Tracking them would be impossible for most men. But Hask was not most men. He hunted the scattered ledgers through attics, storage trunks, and moldy back rooms, until he found them in the possession of Albert Sims, a retired trader who coughed blood into a handkerchief and spoke with the bluntness of a dying man. Sims remembered the mute woman well. "Worst mistake Merchant ever made," he said. His voice rattled like dry corn husks. "Talked about her before the fever took him." Merchant, like all the others, had tried to sell her quickly, but buyers would withdraw their offers after seeing her again hours later staring at her, something unseen stirring behind their eyes. Some could not explain why. Some invented excuses. Some simply refused to return to the holding pens. Merchant kept her far longer than he intended, and during that time he began to fray. He misplaced ledgers. He lost the thread of conversations. His face grew hollow, skin sagging like a man who aged a decade in weeks. Sims described the moment Merchant broke. He said she made him think. Sims rasped. Scenes he'd buried, children he'd taken from their mothers, families he'd split. He said she made him see them, not as numbers, faces. Merchant sold her to Galliard in March 1847, 2 years later. Sweating with fever, he insisted she was still in his house, standing in his hallway, watching him. Sims died 3 weeks after that conversation, but the story did not. Edmund Lel was the beginning, so Hask went to the ashes of Lel's plantation. What remained was a house standing crooked against the marshlight, its windows staring wide like a skull's empty sockets. It was under the control of Lel's only son, Gerald, a man whose nerves twitched under his skin like trapped insects. Gerald refused to speak at first, but Hask was persistent, relentless, haunted. He wandered the neighboring plantations, gathering whispers, fragments, stories that slipped like eel flesh through trembling voices. Edmund Lel, they said, had changed suddenly. A man who once ran his plantation with cold precision began praying, weeping, asking about escape routes for enslaved people he'd spent years profiting from. He had descended into terror, not of hellfire, but of conscience. By the time Hask returned to Gerald with these pieces, something in the younger man cracked on in a dimly lit study, reeking of stale whiskey and dust. Gerald began to tell a story as old as cruelty, and as modern as grief. Rachel, her real name. She had been his father's house servant for years, quiet, skilled, obedient, valuable because she did not speak. Until the breeding program began. Gerald said the words, breeding program, with the practiced numbness of someone who learned long ago to cauterize feeling. They selected women healthy, strong, pliable, and paired them with chosen men to produce infants that fetched high prices at market. They kept records like stud books. They spoke of bloodlines the way one speaks of horseflesh. Rachel bore 3 children. A girl in 1845, a boy in early 1847, a third baby, born too early, dead within hours. Both living children were taken from her long before they could walk, sold, listed, dispersed. Rachel never cried. Rachel never screamed. Rachel never fought, but she hummed at low vibration bone-up, mournful ancient troves from her 4 days after each child was taken, as though grief were an instrument she had learned to play too well. When her 3rd child died, Edmund blamed her. He ordered lashings 10 a day for 7 days. She endured 69 without a sound, but on the 70th she did something Gerald would never forget until the day he died. Alone above a cobbler's shop, she turned her face toward Edmund, opened her mouth, and released a sound that was not a scream, not a word, but a force, a note pulled from the underwater depths of sorrow itself. It made the overseer drop the whip. It made Gerald's skin crawl. It made Edmund Lel go white as moonlit bone. She held his gaze, not with defiance, no, something far more terrible, with understanding. In that instant, Edmund's life collapsed inward, a mirror placed before him, a mirror that reflected not his power, but his crimes. He never recovered. He couldn't sleep. He saw Rachel everywhere. He tried prayer, whiskey, worked nothing, closed the door she had opened inside him. He sold her first, then 10 more enslaved people. Then he prepared to sell everyone on the plantation. And then his heart stopped. Gerald's voice cracked when he finished. She killed him, he whispered, not with poison, not with a curse. She made him human again, and he could not bear it. Hask sat in silence, feeling his own humanity scratching its way up from the depths where he had buried it. He asked the final question, what happened to her children? Gerald's face hardened. Gone. Sold. Their trail was meant to vanish. And in that moment, something in Hask split open like a rotten beam finally giving way. He saw every sale he had ever made, every mother he'd separated, every child carried screaming out of a room while a parent collapsed. He saw them all, and Rachel saw him. When he returned to Charleston and told her what he had learned, she put a hand on his, just a touch. Forgiveness or recognition he could not tell. He wept, and that was the beginning of his transformation. Asterisk. In the weeks that followed his visit to the Lell plantation, Hask moved like a man whose skin no longer fit him. The routines of the auction house, once as natural to him as breath, felt obscene. He found himself staring at the people he sold and wondering how he had ever convinced himself they were property, how he had never noticed the way their eyes followed their children being led away, how he had learned to ignore the shaking hands, the bitten lips, the quiet prayers. Rachel's touch had cracked something. Gerald Lell's confession had shattered the rest. But the transformation that pulled Hask from trader to something resembling a man again did not come only from guilt. It came from purpose, from the terrible, fragile recognition that Rachel was searching for something not even she could name aloud. To her children, 2 names lost, 2 paths scattered like leaves in wind. No mother's memory could be more haunted than hers. Hask could not free her, not legally. The chain of ownership was tangled beyond repair, and if he petitioned the courts, she might be seized and resold to another man, doomed to break beneath her silent truth. But he could do something else. He could make her untraceable. He hired a clerk, a thin young man named Samuel Parrish, whose abolitionist sympathies flickered behind careful eyes. Parrish spent days buried in ledgers, parchment, and crumbling auction records, piecing together fragments of sales from 1845 and 1847. He traced children sold with no recorded mothers, their ages small enough to make the heart ache for months, 6 months, 5 years. Some notes smudged, some intentionally obscured, many incomplete. It was almost impossible work. But almost impossible was still possible. After 3 months, Parrish emerged pale and exhausted with a list of 17 children who might have been Rachel's, 11 boys, 6 girls, sold across Mississippi, Alabama, Georgia, some dead, some vanished, some alive but held in the hands of men who would never willingly relinquish them. Hask gave the list to Rachel. She read it slowly, tracing each line with a fingertip as though the ink itself held a pulse. She could feel through the page. When she reached the end, she wrote a question on her slate with a trembling hand. "Can you help?" Hask knew the truth, the real truth. Under the law, a black woman traveling alone could be seized at any moment. Asking questions about enslaved children would be suicide, and even if she reached them, what then? She had no rights. A mother had fewer legal claims than the chain on a plow horse, but Rachel was a woman who had endured a woman whose silence had already remade the lives of 17 men. How could he deny her the chance to reclaim the only pieces of herself she had left in this world? So he lied. Not out of cruelty, out of mercy. "I'll try," he said. "I can't promise miracles, but I'll try." She nodded, and in her nod was something electric, something ancient, something that made him believe that perhaps miracles did not require permission from the law at all. During the next months, Hask became a man divided: auctioneer by day, ghost smuggler by night. He used his network to gather scraps of information: resales, estate transfers, plantation deaths. He sent letters disguised as inquiries. He bribed clerks for access to sealed documents. He followed whispers the way a man follows a trail of smoke through a burning building. By January 1852, he had narrowed the list to 5 children who matched Rachel's own with uncanny accuracy to boys, 3 girls each, somewhere in the South, each impossibly far from her reach. To confirm them, Rachel herself would have to travel, but how? That answer came from Parrish. Charleston's Underground Railroad was small, secretive, always in danger but real. Parrish had contacts. He could not promise safety, only possibility. The railroad could help Rachel travel north, where free black communities could help search for her children. They would find ways to move information back into the slave states without arousing suspicion, sending messengers. Letters encoded in scripture, whispered names passed in safe houses. It was dangerous, but doing nothing was more dangerous still. So on a moonless night in February 1852, Rachel left Charleston. She did not look back. Hask did. He watched her disappear into the shadows with 2 guides, a shawl over her head and the document Parrish had prepared, a folded list of possible children she might seek, held close to her chest like a heartbeat. Before she departed, she wrote one final message on her slate and pressed it into Hask's hands. "Thank you for remembering you are human." Then she was gone. Hask stood in the doorway long after her footsteps faded, feeling the weight of her words settle across his soul. Like a burial shroud, she had freed him more than he had ever freed her, and the cost of that truth would unravel Charleston in ways the men of the slave trade had never imagined. Asterisk. Rachel vanished into the north like a whisper carried by winter wind, and Charleston continued, pretending not to feel the absence she left behind. But absence can be a wound, and wounds have a way of bleeding through walls no matter how tightly men try to seal them. Hask never saw her again, never received a letter in her hand, never heard her voice if she even still remembered how to use it, but the railroad occasionally sent him fragments of news, drifting back to him like messages in bottles washed ashore. She reached Philadelphia, then New York, then other cities whose names the South preferred not to utter, places where enslaved people became citizens, where their stories grew sharp and bright and dangerous, and everywhere she went, she helped silent hands tending the newly freed silent presence guiding the terrified across unfamiliar streets, silent eyes reading pain like scripture. Somewhere in Georgia, a girl of 8 had been identified, a girl whose age and features matched the daughter taken from her in 1845. Intermediaries made contact. The girl had an owner, a cruel man with a ledger where children were numbers and tears were irrelevant details. Was the girl truly Rachel's? There was no way to be certain. Hask imagined Rachel reading the news, her face still as a pond hiding storms beneath its surface. He never learned the outcome. The underground railroad dissolved into secrecy again. Shifting names, shifting routes, shifting ghosts. Parrish lost contact with those who had once risked their lives to trace Rachel's steps. The thread snapped, but in every uncertainty there was a heartbeat of possibility. Life sometimes leaves doors half open so hope can slip through. While Rachel sought her children, Charleston trembled. Hask gathered the tradesmen whose fingers still smelled faintly of wax and iron. Chainsan told them the truth. The woman they feared was gone, and she would never be sold again. He proposed forged manumission papers, backdated, signed by ghosts, stamped with seals that no one would question, not because they wanted her free, because they wanted her forgotten. They all agreed. Cowards always do when survival outweighs profit. But something had changed in Charlton's marrow. Rachel's shadow had begun doing what no law, no sermon, no abolitionist pamphlet had ever managed to do. It made men think. Within 2 years, auction houses closed in eerie succession, 3 of the largest shutting their doors forever, their owners unable to continue their trade without feeling her silent gaze on their hands. Some moved away, some drank themselves into one hanged himself. A few wandered the streets after dark as though expecting her to emerge from the fog and stand before them. And Hask, Virgil Hask, once proud dealer of flesh, closed his own auction house in 1856. He sold the building. He established a small fund to help freed people carve out new beginnings in a city built on their suffering. It was tiny, almost insignificant in the monstrous scale of what had been done. But guilt had finally worn the shape of action. The men who had owned Rachel fared worse still. Plantations collapsed under debts, fires, abandoned families. 7 men died. 5 fled. Others lived but were never whole again. Charleston christened it a curse, because curses are easier to accept than conscience. By the time cannon fire opened over Fort Sumter, the Low Country had already begun rotting from within, its foundations crumbling under the weight of truths it had spent generations denying, and when the war came, the old world died screaming. The plantations where Rachel once walked were burned, reclaimed by vines, swallowed by mud. Children whose cries once filled the quarters grew into adults who carried freedom in their footsteps, leaving footprints on land their ancestors had bled into. And still, she was nowhere recorded in the official histories, but echoes survive where ink does not. A Quaker in Philadelphia wrote of a mute woman who calmed the trembling newly escaped. A sailor in Baltimore remembered a silent stranger who carried grief in her eyes like a moon eclipsed. Frederick Douglass's papers mentioned a woman who never spoke but whose presence steeled the resolve of every person in the room. Could these have been her, or were they only reflections of countless women broken and remade by the same cruel system? No one can say, but Hask, in the last winter before his death in 1868, wrote one final journal entry, shaky, fragile script barely legible. I have heard that a woman like Rachel was seen in Philadelphia. She was accompanied by a young woman who called her mother. I cannot prove it. Perhaps I only want to believe it, but I choose belief. For after all the suffering she endured, perhaps God or fate or the sheer brutal force of her will granted her this one mercy. Hope, even faint, is its own form of truth. Charleston buried the records, burned the evidence, pretended Lot 47 had never existed, but a story like hers cannot truly be destroyed. It survives in fragments, smoke-stained ledgers, whispers in taverns, broken men who once thought themselves unbreakable, and in the cracks of the city's grand houses, in the stones of the auction block, in the shadows along the Ashley River where night insects hum like distant memory. Her presence lingers. She was never a ghost. She was never a curse. She was a mirror, the kind that shows a man not his face, but his soul. And in a world built on cruelty, a mirror like that is the most terrifying thing of all. What happened to her children? To her, to all the women whose voices were stolen by the system that sought to unmake them? History offers no answers, but sometimes silence speaks louder than any record. Rachel's silence shook the South. Her truth, unspoken but undeniable, survives where names do not. If you listen closely, you can still hear the hum she carried in her chest. The low, trembling note of grief turned into judgment, of judgment turned into revelation, of revelation turned into a freedom no system could contain. That sound did not die. It lives on in every story we are brave enough to tell. Asterisk.